Okay, to continue, and I will remind everyone of the time because we want to have time for questions and answers. Our next speaker is Nisha Nair. And Nisha, I'm not sure, I heard you're going to talk about gender. Okay. Nisha is from the Global Law School, and she's a fellow at IAHED.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is an honor to be a part of this panel. Addressing discrimination and exclusion in higher education would entail some amount of self-reflection, where apart from affirmative action by the state, institutions, academics, and administrators would have to be conscious of the implicit systemic bias and develop a self-awareness which must flow from the leadership to individuals across the level. The beginning point is to acknowledge that we are all biased. Now, the idea of self-discovery, which was referred to earlier on, connects to the idea of self-awareness, which is the key to self-monitor, which is critical for consciously and deliberately moving away from an androcentric and systemic gender bias. This self-awareness would challenge organizational assumptions and would require the individuals to be open to seeking and accepting feedback, which might be difficult, but unless our lacunas are evidenced, we would not be in a position to examine our inherent bias and achieve gender equity and promote an inclusive and productive work environment. Educational institutions across the levels are supposed to be miniatures of society, therefore reflective of and, most importantly, responding to societal realities. But educational institutions are also invested with the agency, with a transformational power which must manifest itself as an agent of change and progress within the society. Any attempt of addressing discrimination demands a foundation or a framework which is built on sound grounds of justice and equality. Educational institutions can and do play a pivotal role in building, developing, and acting as an important agent of social change. Now, discrimination in the context of education can be understood as a segregation, exclusion on the basis of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, economic condition, birth, which nullifies or impairs equality of treatment in education, as defined by the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education and the Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Now, this may manifest itself intentionally or unintentionally owing to acculturation, bias, lack of awareness, lack of sensitization, and orthodoxy in one's thoughts and actions. While the intentional manifestation of discrimination, to an extent, can be addressed through affirmative action by the state, as regarded in several studies, manifesting itself in the context of India in the form of reservation in the policies of employment and education institution, reservation for members of transgender community more recently, need-based scholarship programs and fee concession, the attitudinal and the intentional aspect leading to discrimination remains, which can only be dealt with at the level of individual and by extension society through institutional intervention. A recent study published by the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education on student diversity and social inclusion locates the role of educational institutions at the heart of the effort for addressing discrimination and exclusion vis-a-vis gender, minorities, and disability. The study looks at higher education institutions in 6 states of India, including Bihar, Delhi, Karnataka, Kerala, Maharashtra, and Uttar Pradesh. The findings suggest that the higher education system has made a commendable improvement in achieving social diversity, though new forms of inequalities have emerged in the form of institutional and disciplinary segregations. Further, social disparities in academic integration in classroom, and the teaching-learning process continues to persist. Social exclusion, stereotypes, and identity-based peer group formation also remains an unresolved concern and pose challenge for students from socially excluded groups. The study moots that it is essential to fully weave diversity and inclusion in the institutional fabric to make campuses more inclusive, to strengthen the existing institutional mechanisms that address the academic and social concern of diverse students, and to ensure greater sensitivity from managers and professionals of higher education institutions towards students from socially excluded groups facing numerous challenges. The need is to constitute and promote an institutional culture that values and celebrates diversity rather than looks at it as a hindrance to quality education. Equity and equity in access to higher education institutions by disadvantaged groups is the first step in addressing discrimination in higher education institutions by enhancing social diversity. It is therefore important for educational institutions to frame policies and measures that cater to and accommodate diversity in faculty, staff, and student within the institution. While there has been an increase in female student enrollment at primary school level at 48%, there has been a high dropout at secondary school level, which stands at 30%. Consequently reducing the participation in higher education. Now, if we want to reap the benefit of the demographic dividend offered by our diverse human capital in transforming ourselves into a knowledge-based economy, we cannot afford to leave half the population behind. Now, the extent of gender inequality can be assessed by examining recent statistics, where the total enrollment in higher education stands to be at 36.6 million, with 19.2 million male and 17.4 million female students. Now, women constitute 47.6% of the total enrollment in higher education, but female labor force participation rate is at a mere of 27%. The share of female students is lowest in institutions of national importance at 24.06%, followed by state private open universities and deemed universities. Though there has been an increase in access for women to higher education, with women outnumbering men in BA and education courses, even at master's level in sciences, women stands to 50%. There is still a significant gap of female participation in professional courses in comparison to academic courses. Now, does this relate to the cost of pursuing a professional degree, which is significantly higher than a conventional degree? Does this speak to the mindset which encourages women to take humanity courses rather than technical and professional courses? Now, in terms of employment, there are at present 12,84,755 teachers, out of which about 58% are male teachers and 42 are female teachers. At all India level, there are merely 72 female teachers as per 100 male teachers. The total, so if you look at the data with respect to persons with disability, there is 39 female per 100 male teachers. Women form only 24% of entry-level professionals, out of which 19% reach senior-level management roles, and yet are paid 20% less in salary than men. Why is it that, in spite of an increase in enrollment for women in higher education, indicating better access, there is a low participation of women in workforce? Does this speak to the socio-cultural reality where women are still expected to restrict aspirations over domesticity? Now, the draft national policy of education for women, 2016, and the Saksham measures for ensuring safety for women and programs for gender sensitization on campus report, released in 2013, stresses on gender sensitization in higher education, and it has found it to be the weakest in higher education institution. To develop a culture of diversity and inclusion and move towards gender sensitization, One can probably consider institutional hiring practices where they promote representation from people from disadvantaged group and gender, consider gender, provide for merit-based and need-based seat allocations responding to demography of state where the institution is located. Another step could be to conduct workshops, courses, and training for faculty, students, and administrators to make them aware of the concerns of exclusion on the basis of gender and caste and religion. The Saksham report also makes a recommendation to the effect. Across the field of education, leadership needs to mirror the diverse student body that it represents. There's a conscious effort that needs to be made to encourage participation of individuals representing diverse and minority group in leadership positions. Another very important component for gender sensitization is legal literacy on the rights and the various laws, the prevention, such as prevention of sexual harassment at workplace, criminal law amendment, the rights of transgender bills, so on. If these are made a part of the curriculum, it would greatly increase conversation and awareness in the context of sensitization vis-a-vis gender across spectrum. Universities comprise of a heterogeneous population, all of whom needs to be represented adequately. Higher education institution must be conscious of its role in promotion of sustainable environment to account for and respond to the issues of diversity and exclusion. Institutional mechanisms that are premeditated to overcome the collective disadvantage and fortify academic competencies are imperative for addressing and sustaining diversity within the educational institution to enable a successful transition of students from socially disadvantaged group to higher education, thus contributing in the creation of an egalitarian society. Thank you.
Nisha, thank you very much for that very, say, concise summary of the statistics, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot more to say about them. Thank you very much. Okay, our final speaker is Sarava, and she's going to speak about pedagogy in the classroom.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for inviting me for this. I'm actually going to try and speak about a few things together. And this is a topic of great interest to me. It's something I try, I mean, it comes in first to my life as part of my biography because my parents come from diverse religious backgrounds. So my mother was Hindu, my father was Muslim, and the first part of their relationship to higher education is something I want to mention because we sometimes delete biographies in our systems of knowledge. So my mother had to keep running away to get herself higher education because my grandfather refused to pay for her. So my whole life was about how many times she ran away to get her master's degree, etc., and her bachelor's degrees. And she finally became an academic. And my father actually grew up in a very impoverished Muslim family in Kanpur, and he had no exposure to, there was nobody in his family who had studied even all of schooling. And so his whole story is related to how he finally studied, did an MPhil from Aligarh Muslim University, and he basically studied on scholarship from class 7th onwards. And it's very interesting because when I went to college, I went to Stephens and this whole thing you do in Delhi, and my sister went to Berkeley. My father's point was like, I did not even know these places existed. I only knew BHU and AMU as somebody who's growing up. So so for me, higher education, of course, was something very, very critical and important. And it's actually a privilege, and it cannot be taken for granted. The other thing is, of course, my own biography as now I can call myself an academic, or nearly an academic, is I actually studied philosophy. That's what I studied in college. And then I went on to do social anthropology. I did my MPhil in sociology, social anthropology. And now I teach in the School of Art and Architecture. So I actually, for me, and this is exactly what I want to be doing. I like the fact that have moved between disciplines. My PhD work was on religion and architecture, so that's how I landed up being in architecture. And I have taught architecture in other places. I've taught mixed studios. I've taught students who are artists and architects sociological ideas, and then learned back from them architectural ideas. So that, I mean, and that I find amazing about being in the Jindal School of Art and Architecture, which has been able to give me that space to tap into all forms of diverse knowledge that I kind of come from. One of the things that I found, and I mean, these are what Shiv was talking about in the morning, are ethical interjections. And ethical interjections into the spaces of diversity, of course, start with the personal. And they start with how we kind of graft them into our curriculums, how we graft them into our classroom teaching or outside the classroom. And I mean, I want to briefly kind of talk about some of the things I try to do in my classrooms, and well, I tell the students to fall in love. I mean, I encourage that. I mean, we have Special Marriages Act, so I mean, I tell them do all this stuff, you know, break all the barriers. I said I don't want to hear who's from which caste and wo us gaon se hai, wo yahan se hai. I said, you know, so I mean, how do you kind of I know one shouldn't be, there are lots of rules. I'm also in the disciplinary committee, but I mean, a generic sense of the fact that suddenly university is the place where you literally suspend all the things that you come from your families, from your, you know, the backgrounds of caste and religion. And I've literally seen students transform. And I find that something which, as pedagogues, we really, really need to think about, because it's not just about teaching a class and walking out. You know, I'm not just teaching law or, you know, some sociology of caste. It is, some of them in the first terms and the first years, what they say and what they say later is completely different. And I think that is something, these are the kind of, in sociology, we call it the kind of the, you know, the everyday, ordinary aspects of what we might write in policy reports, what we write through data, through different epistemologies of thinking. But this is the kind of the texture of the ordinary. And I think that is something which is very interestingly done at the level of the higher education and the university. So I ran a studio classes are run, me and another architect colleague, we ran a class called Materials in Making. And materials in making, technically, usually in architecture schools, is like, okay, you make a few, you know, you make a wooden box or something, or and then, you know, but we kind of moved between theoretical ideas. There was a class we taught on the architect and the carpenter. I actually worked with them. I took them to a brick kiln, very close to the campus, and we were reading Marx and working with the brick kiln workers. And actually, those bricks are the ones which are being supplied to make the hostel in the campus. So it was very interesting for students to actually see conditions of labor, conditions of making, conditions of the gendered differences of a place which looks like, I mean, a brick, can you generally imagine it as a male space? But of course, what are the women workers doing? So how does one make them see these very, very simple things which they might have taken for granted, and build in that kind of what she was calling the ethical imagination in their everydays. So, and the other things that we of course ended up doing is we ran a woodwork studio, and interestingly enough, there was the women and the men, the boys, I would call them, were equal participants. It's not like the girls do only another kind of exercise and the boys do all the woodwork. So that was something we tried to work out. Also, one of the things that I found, it actually happened, we were doing an exercise, and this is, I mean, I wish I could tell Shiv this. We actually did an exercise on collecting forms of the color red in Old Delhi. So we moved between looking at the stones in Jama Masjid to all the kind of materials available. And eventually, the students were very inhibited about entering a space like Jama Masjid, because they were like, you know, many of them had actually never been inside a mosque. or a space which is a kind of a public space, mosque space. Eventually, I landed up taking a class in the wings on the side in a hot afternoon of July. And then everybody was like, ma'am, this was very easy. Why were we so inhibited? So how do we kind of make them step out of these thresholds and these biases that they come from and build? And now I think at least this batch, this is our first batch, there's a sense of confidence of being able to traverse different spaces, being able to have conversations with people from different backgrounds. I find this report very interesting, and I think it's a very commendable exercise, because these things are very important to do in any institutional space. What I think what we could build more on this would be thinking of new epistemologies or systems of knowledge which accommodate for new forms of data in it. So forms of conversation, thinking actually in detail about the forms of pedagogy that we teach, in whether it's in law, whether it's in business, whether it's in development studies, and how do these then start churning the wheels of diversity in the pedagogic space. So this is like, I call this the first level, and I worked a lot with state governments before, and I worked in rural education and public health. And the first level cut was, of course, the data collection and understanding what the data is throwing at us. But then thinking of other mixed methods of kind of working through this. My last section is a little bit, is more based on my interest in gender. And this is, recently we were trying to study the IIT Delhi building with the students, and the students were like, the women students were like, ma'am, there are no toilets on this floor. So apparently, IIT Delhi till today has, okay, I'm just finishing, has just toilets on every alternate floor. I mean, because women were not supposed to be going to these places. And they still have lesser women students in IIT Delhi's. There's a study done at, I'm going to quickly give you 3 points on the studies that I looked at. On citation index, Princeton did a study where they said in 1980s there was less than 10% citation of women authors, and by 2016 it has gone up to 45%. The All India Survey of Higher Education report looks at female full professors, 37 for 100 males, associate professors, 58 for 100 males. And then, of course, temporary teachers and tutorial teachers, women are higher. There has been a gradual increase in students going beyond masters to PhD, but generally women do the undergraduate thing and then they're married off. One last thing that I'm just going to quickly conclude with is, of course, there's this whole thing of, there's another study in 2017 done, I looked up, these are not trivial studies, which said that women faculty land up doing more administrative and committee work than actual research work. There's a study actually in Science, which is one of the most important journals, which said that, this was published in 2015, and this is something I find very, very compelling. The strong predicator of female representation in various academics fields was how empathetically the discipline emphasizes the belief that brilliance is critical for success. So this idea, and I studied philosophy, and I lived in a science institute called TIFR in Bombay for 10 years. So this idea of the brilliant genius is always the male. And philosophy, one was always dealing with this, because you could not argue as a woman in philosophy. I mean, you can't think of women philosophers' names. So how are these hierarchies satiated into the field, into our disciplinary practices, and into academic spaces? And the only thing one can do, that's why I am a believer of working on these ideas of diversity through pedagogic exercises, so that the students themselves start to see this early on, and not just through workshops, but through direct classroom teaching. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I can see that everyone has a lot to say, and I hope there will be a publication of some of the ideas, because we have very rich presentations. but we would like to hear from you. And I pulled out a couple of themes from this. One is, which several people mentioned, is learning from others, learning through interactive pedagogies, which is something that seems to be a theme going through. Secondly, is going beyond the statistics. Everyone gets into the statistics because the statistics are easy to find, but as some of you mentioned, the statistics really don't tell the story. So that there are other ways of going about these. And one thing that we didn't mention, and I'd like to go into later, certainly not here, is intersectionality. Because everything that we talk about in the diversity of this group here points out to the fact that questions of gender, of disability, and of disability and minority are really all interconnected. You know, we can find that through statistics, but we can find it because of the invisibility of people in our campuses, in our workplaces. And then finally, another one is a point to bring out is that this is a very long project. Creating a culture of diversity on a campus is not something that we can do by implementing a law, creating a committee. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of introspection, to use the words of Walter Benjamin. My story becomes your story, becomes our story. And that's the direction I think we really want to take. So I'd like to hear from your questions. We have about 10 minutes for this. And let's hear from anyone who has a question or a comment. And, okay. Let's see. Do you want?
They can use this one.
Okay. Do you have a mic?
Yes, I have. Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Williams Iheme, and I teach law at the Gender Global Law School. Personally, I want to thank the speakers for their brilliant presentations because I personally have been enriched. Quickly, the question is, you would agree with me that in democracy, we have fairly settled it that the majority will always have their way, and the minority, bad luck, will have to be untwisted much of the time. But universities, unlike parliament, try to create spaces where they can pursue truth, no matter where it leads. Now, if this is the case, we also acknowledge that universities have limited resources in terms of funds and time. So my question to the speakers who talked about inclusiveness would be, do you think that there should be a cutoff point towards inclusiveness? And if there is such possibility, do you think also that it would lead us to that tight corner of being a census? Yeah. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, who would like to? Okay. Another question.
So thank you very much for the presentations. They were very enlightening. I wanted to make two comments. First of all, I think, when we are looking at identity, James Bank kind of puts forward the idea of microcultural identity. So, when we are looking at a person may experience oppression not just because the person has disability, but in addition because she's a woman, she comes from a lower caste. So we have to look at those layers of oppression. And that unique identity, as he describes beautifully, is more like, almost like a fingerprint for each one of us. So I think, in trying to understand diversity, it's important for us to move beyond looking at it singularly as one aspect of identity and just focusing on one particular aspect of the identity. The second thing I wanted to bring to attention, and Mansi talked about the narrative of Rohit Formula. In the area of early childhood education, when we think of inclusion, we think of three major pillars. and that is access, participation, and systemic support. And you know, most of the time when we consider educational institutions, whether it's preschools, schools, or colleges, we stop at access. Once they have entry into the building, that's it. But if we see, you know, and I think again, Rohit's narrative is a real example of, you know, how things unfold when we don't look into participation and we don't necessarily provide the systemic support. So again, you know, and this systemic support has to consider the ecology in which we are functioning. So I think earlier she brought up the point that, you know, what is called, you know, reasonable accommodation. So, and that's not something that's a right in the Indian context. Therefore, we need to create other ways to address that issue. We cannot just sort of say, okay, that's not there, and therefore we don't address it. So I wanted to bring these to the table.
Okay, comments and not a question. All right, thank you. Another question.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abhishek. I don't know how many of you have watched this movie called Brokeback Mountain. It's a movie which is set in 1963. So it talks about homosexuality, bisexuality. And I watched this movie 6 years back when I dropped right after high school. So it helped me understand the concept. It helped me accept the concept, like how Professor Nisha Nair was mentioning about self-awareness. So the movie was a medium for me. So my question to the panelists is, what do you think is the best medium for the higher education, with context of higher education, for people to accept or understand diversity and inclusion? The medium, the perfect medium that, because I do remember Professor Nisha Nair saying that we can include it in the curriculum. So other than that, apart from that, what do you think would be the best medium? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, and I'll take one more question and then we'll answer these and see what our time's like. Another question? No?
One last question. A lot of the literature on inclusion talks about creating inclusive policies. And of course, we have administrators over here. So we need a combination of inclusive policy, practice, and also inclusive institutional culture or the environment that many of you talked about. So I would really like to hear from the administrators what they think could be done better in terms of institutionalizing inclusive policies. And also to see that those policies are actually implemented and practiced. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I think we will start with the first question. Who would like to answer that or give an opinion about what is the cutoff point for inclusivity? Is there a cutoff point?
So you started with saying that democracy is about majority, and one would think that, you know, Ambedkar, I'll cite him on this, he's talking about what separates a democracy from becoming a tyranny of the mob, right? So the benchmark for seeing what is the true spirit of democracy is the spirit of justice. That what will decide that justice is being met and in what conditions. So we've had examples of, for example, Jawaharlal Nehru University adopting a deprivation point index at the time of admission to account for different kinds of marginalities and experiences of exclusion people come from, and then to accommodate that in figuring out merit-based admissions. Is that sufficient? From the narratives we've heard across today, at the entry point, this kind of creating support structures can help, but it's largely about what Moni Malika said. It's about the ecology of the institution. That, you know, it's about the ecology, the spirit with which you think about institutional culture. So there, where do you stop at? That I'll be inclusive for 60% of the times and I'll be exclusive for the rest of the 40%. So I think it has to become part of the conversational culture. Then, you know, then you don't need to actually quantify at every instance, then your indicators will speak for themselves, when you think of the ecology and environmental culture.
Okay, thank you. Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, so talking about the question of the institutional culture, and to respond to what Maushami was saying, so when you're talking about promoting diversity or inclusion, like Manasi also pointed out, that it has to flow from the indicators that you have within your policy framework. So with respect to creating a culture, we need to understand that individuals will build the culture. So when we are talking about diversity, a conscious attempt has to be made. So whether in the context of gender, if it's, say, gender-blind hiring policies, promotion policies, or being accommodative of existing gender reality vis-a-vis individual roles assigned by the society and the kind of pressure that it puts on individual, therefore allowing your policies to accommodate that reality. And then accordingly, so whether it is about having a policy for, parental policy in place, or a policy where there is a female faculty member or male faculty member, and the institution understands that they have to provide a framework for allow them to participate successfully in taking care of their personal or familial responsibility vis-a-vis, what happens at the professional level. So that is how you build a culture, where you try to attain for a point where the foundation is laid in an ideal manner, where all individuals, irrespective of their gender, can perform and can be most productive, can be their best within the framework, professional framework. And to respond to your question about how we can move beyond curriculum, now curriculum shouldn't be just understood as the syllabus that is transacted within the classroom. You can, Professor Zaidi also spoke about how she has inculcated the ideas of inclusion and diversity within her pedagogical framework. Beyond that, in Jindal, you have many student-led initiatives, particularly with respect to gender. There are reading groups, there are gender circles. In 2017, there was a gender festival that was organized where 3 research centers came together, and faculty across Jindal participated by presenting talks, getting trans people of representatives and leaders from transgender community to come and perform at Jindal, speak about issues. And there was an in-house play that was directed by a professor in the law school, and where students across Jindal participated. So these are other ways through which you provide platforms for conversation and dialogue and even research on these issues, and get, and instill diversity and inclusion in the institutional culture.
You asked a question about, what is the best medium to promote diversity, and you cited one film. Of course, media has a powerful role, and it can build bridges across communities, but it can also, work on the existing fissures and divide communities, and like any insensitive and sensationalism and other. We have seen any number of examples where the media's power has been misused to direct communal riots and other. It's basically, one needs to be aware of the various fault lines and social ethnic divides, etc. And the self-awareness and the consciousness education could be a best medium. And ma'am, I agree with you about one has to understand the layers of oppression, etc. And you talked about you talked about reasonable accommodation. The Canadian courts have interpreted this doctrine of reasonable accommodation. At the same time, they said it should not place an undue burden on the state. Cutoff point for inclusivity. I do not know what you mean by cutoff point. Do you mean to say that we can have this much inclusiveness and beyond which no more? And basically, when the idea is to embrace the inclusivity in all its dimensions, and not to have a cutoff point.
If I understand correctly, he mentioned a public policy challenge in relation to inclusion. It's not just, what he's saying is that at what stage your pursuit of inclusion will inevitably affect other equally important considerations that you might have in any form of public policy decision making. So you'll have to take a stand on it, in the sense he's making a legitimate argument that how far should we be going in inclusion?
I follow that. I mean,
development policy in contemporary times is defined by human capability approach. So if you take the human capability approach, then the state policies itself is guided by, if you take the human capability approach, the state development policy itself is guided by this larger overarching emphasis on justice, that unless justice is met at disaggregated level, and each life is affected, then that GDP is not translating into equitable growth. So it's a resource question for the state, but now that the state itself is guided by this perspective, its take towards how resources are to be allocated and what gets prioritized in the development planning, that itself gets altered.
Also, it's also about how we frame the question of resource allocation. So I feel like if you frame the question of resource allocation as an investment into the future, by sort of as a cost now, but that cost is an investment into the future, then sort of that resource allocation can be sort of done in a different way. Because also when you think of it not from a public policy perspective, but as from the perspective of a university, that sort of Professor Shiv talked about, sort of planning for the future, right? Creating the future. You're changing the future. So if you want the university to be a space that sort of creates a change for the future, then you have to invest in that future. And that investment must be different from what you would otherwise do as the state. On your point about experiences, my experience with disability has been that you can watch as many movies as you like, but unless you actually experience disability for yourself, like just walk with someone with a disability, and you'll see sort of the number of challenges they face. Just spend maybe just 1 hour with someone who comes from a different background from you, just in their regular routine. And that is a very powerful way of sort of experiencing someone else's sort of, what someone else might be going through, maybe from a different background or whatever. So that's another way.
So this question that you said that I can watch a movie and it can change the way I think, but a lot of students think like this, huh? They think they'll watch movie, what is the point of coming to class? What is the point of going to university, right? I mean, the point is, as Shilpi was also saying, when you are in the university space, when you're in the classroom space, you are interfacing with people who are not you and not from your backgrounds, and not, and in a sense, we have a lot of diversity in Jindal also, even though it's a private university. So you are able to have conversations which you may not be able to have later even. You might be sticking to the same world of class and caste and religion, or sexual preferences. So to be able to understand pedagogy and knowledge as a system of interactions and dialectics in the university space is what becomes very critical in understanding and working with diversity for the rest of your life. So that's what I would say. I mean, watch the movies, but come to class.
Well, okay, what a wealth of wisdom we have here. Thank you all very much. I was going to give my final word, but I'm not going to. I'm going to save it for writing later. And what? No. You know why? You folks have 15 minutes for lunch. Okay, thank you.